This is not so much me telling you about my work, it's more like I'm going to show you some of my own work. But I want to suggest something to you that might apply to all the different kinds of work that people do. The reality is when a visiting artist comes, and if they only talk about their work, then maybe you connect and maybe you don't. And what I wanted to do is try to have a little bit of a discussion about something that maybe we all have to deal with, no matter what our field is, no matter what our discipline is, no matter what our medium is. And so I'm going to suggest it. I'm just going to throw it out there. And I'll let you guys talk back at me. You can push back. It's fine. Do you mind if I gesticulate with this while I'm talking? I'm going to suggest that we are all sentimental. And I'm going to do that by talking through a couple concepts dealing with meaning and association in art. And we're going to talk about everything from sculpture to music to painting. It's going to be a little bit of a range. And I'm going to do it real fast in half an hour, 40 minutes or so. Again, I'm Matt Ballou. Been at Mizzou for a while. And when I was a kid, I had this little chipmunk that was my stuffed animal. And I loved my stuffed animal. How many people had a stuffed animal? Or some object when you were a kid that was your thing? It was like, made you feel good, right? And it was something where everybody has that, right? Everybody's got some object, or it could be even something simple. I mean, like when I was a kid, I collected stones when we were traveling. That for some reason is penetrated with meaning. It's been imbued with meaning. But if I showed you my chipmunk, you'd be like, okay, it's a natty, nasty, gross, old, horrible stuffed animal, and you could understand that maybe it had been loved, right? But you wouldn't feel anything for it, right? And art is actually one of those really interesting, weird spaces where when we go into a museum or when we go into a gallery, somehow we get this idea that maybe there is meaning invested in those objects, in those spaces, in that literature, in that performance, in that music. And so, just want to talk a little bit about those things. And as a preface, last year, Peter Sheldall, who's a esteemed critic for The New Yorker, was interviewed in The Broken Rail. And he was talking about feelings, and he said that feelings, they're the actual us. Thoughts are just lawyers for our feelings. Memory is a pile of stories determined by feelings and constantly revised to fit new feelings. And I think at times people push back at the idea that we're sentimental because they say, well, I'm rational. I make choices. Or I have had experiences that make me hard. Or I have had whatever that makes me feel that I need to have an orientation to the world that's more intellectual. But what I would say is that because of the way that memories are created, and because of the way that we are so filtered, our senses are so filtered in how they engage with the world, that in a vast majority are things that we consider rational, are actually filtered through that felt experience. And so I would say that even something that is determinedly hard or determinedly a fact actually comes through the feelings. And people often will say, well, if you feel it, then maybe it's not as real. But I would really push back against that. And I would say that feelings and emotions and experiences are actually the first line by which we address the world, by which we understand the world. And so I was actually really, really pleased when I saw this really old white dude say this, because in some sense, that's not the opinion that a lot of people have had. Particularly in the arts, when at universities and whatnot, when we're expected to perform up to some sort of when I have to do a dossier or when I have to do a review or when I have to do these different things, it's like I'm trying to live up to a scientific standard that's a different field. And those things have this sort of fact-based or intellectualization of the field has taken over, when I really think that what we're trying to do is get at something that's evocative about our experience that we can't pin down in language. that we can't pin down in an intellectual way. And so we engage with it with the logic of materials, or we engage with it in terms of a logic of visual dynamics. That's the reason why we're artists. So we've all had these kinds of things, right? We've had our teddy bears. I had my chipmunk. But I also had something like this. When I was born, I did not have the ability to create a bond in my enamel to the core of my teeth. So by the time I was 3, my teeth were chalky and like breaking and falling off, my baby teeth. And I had to go in, and one of my first memories is going in when they still gassed little kids and seeing the mask come down, they were going to gas me. And they put metal caps, metal crowns on all my teeth. And so my life, for 20 some odd years, was enmeshed in the reality of these teeth. Like now I have no teeth. They've all been pulled. I have all fake teeth. But for 25 years, I had constant pain radiating up into my head. Nobody else experienced that. Nobody else knew what was going on. But to me, the teeth became this sort of icon of chronic pain. So when I make an image like this, you may not get why the teeth are like that. That may seem like a joke. That may seem like some kind of distortion, right? But actually, it's kind of a poignant reminder to me about where I've been and where I'm going and what's happening as you see my dentures popping out there. So all I'm saying is that meaning gets embedded in objects through experiences. The experiences are necessarily subjective. They're not about facts. You guys have not necessarily had this same experience. But if you've had any tooth pain, you can know where I'm coming from. So where does meaning come from? Well, one of the main people that I've studied in my academic career, and I'm pretty sure that Natalie and I talked about John Dewey back in the day. John Dewey was a pragmatist philosopher in the 20th century who talked about the idea of how objects get meaning. Because so often we think of objects as having intrinsic meaning. Like my wedding band means something because of what it is. But that's not true. Dewey shows us that objects gain meaning by our intellectual, spiritual, emotional, physical engagement with them in the real world. There's nothing intrinsic to this. This wedding ring is a choice that societies have made about gold and about circles and about value over the course of generations and generations. It has no intrinsic meaning, but it is really a social contract, and we have decided that it means something. Okay? And so, if I go with Dewey, and that's a good place to start, Art as Experience, 1934. And then one of his main students was Joseph Kupfer, who actually wrote the inverse, Experience as Art. Basically, what those guys were talking about was this idea that as I have an experience with something, it becomes more and more meaningful. And as I learn how to translate that experience for others, I can start to share that meaning. To me, that entire realm of engagement is subjective, and it has a sentimental quotient to it, which is not meant to be negative. It's meant to be a positive way in which we associate with one another. So, not to get technical, but how many of you have heard about the mirror neurons that we all have? Right. Mirror neurons basically fire in your brain, in your motor cortex, when you see somebody else make a gesture in space. When you see somebody fall, or when you see somebody working really hard, on an athletic field, or when you see your friend fall out on the ice, your brain actually will fire in the motor cortex to respond as if you were doing it. Studies have shown that people do this when they're observing artworks as well. When they see a gesture implied, there's a little bit of a firing in the brain, indicating that you are having a similar experience to what is happening in the field of view. So that's what comes down to that sense of the haptic, that sense of it being so felt and made and muscly and palpable, translates into my mirror neurons, and I feel that movement. I feel my hands engaging. I feel my brain engaging with it physically, right? So in some sense, those mirror neurons and that associative context that we build up through funding objects with meaning, like our childhood toys, which function like a vault. They function like a bank that we fill up. That becomes a context in which we all engage with artworks. So when you go into a museum, what's actually happening? When you go into a gallery, when you see anything like that, essentially, someone has tried to figure out a way to give you access. Now, I've already described two ways in which we already have access. We have access subjectively through the fact that we make meaning in the world. So when someone else makes meaning, we can understand, oh, that person has paid attention to that object, or they've paid attention to that picture. And I, as someone who knows how to pay attention, or who has paid attention in the past, can read something into that making, right? Similarly, I can provide points of access by building up standards, context, and crafting associations. And actually, you'll find all over the world in all different types of media that people actually do this all the time. So let's take one example. When Beyonce and Jay-Z went to the Louvre, and they are, I mean, in some sense, it's like this meeting of two different types of cultural institutions, right? You've got the Mona Lisa at the Louvre, and you've got Jay-Z and Beyonce, and they, in their association, in their crafting of a kind of context together, something passes from the Louvre and the Mona Lisa onto Jay-Z and Beyonce. There's a reason why they wanted to take a selfie in front of the Mona Lisa, right? They wanted to craft that association. And they were creating a kind of equanimity. They're saying, we are an institution as well. And I'm not just visiting it, because no one else gets to get that close. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, they get to be close, because, and it's indicating their status as a kind of cultural institution. And so that kind of associative context, when you overlay that with the meaning making that happens in all these different ways that we've discussed, becomes something that's really, really powerful. And then crafting that association with one another, if you think about when Jay-Z did Magna Carta Holy Grail, I mean, just the title, Magna Carta Holy Grail, right? Magna Carta, like this like foundational document of democracy. Holy Grail, this spiritualized, ephemeral, completely apocryphal object that contains a chalice that contains Christ's blood, right? Putting those things together and crafting an association. When he takes the sculpture that's in the Met, he puts his name across it. He blanks his name out. There's a sense in which he's crafting a kind of association between the institution of the Met and himself, just like they did with the Mona Lisa. And in fact, the album itself hits on, almost every song hits on multiple art world associations, cultural associations. He's doing it on purpose. He's saying, hello, here's my status, here's the status of another historical structure, they are co-equal, right? He's doing it on purpose. So that's what you want to watch for when you're going into a museum. This is at the big atrium in the Met. This could seem like a really strange space, like what is there for me? But if you go back and think about the idea that all of these objects were built with the intention of attention, right? That someone is paying attention and crafting with care, and then another person is meant to come along and notice the virtuosity with which it's made, or the sensitivity with which it's made, and then using that subjective capacity, that emotional capacity, that mirror neuron capacity, is then able to sense, that's important. So it's not necessarily that we see Jay-Z and Lorenzi as completely co-equal. But we sense that and this is what all great artists do, right? We build associations between disparate elements. So Jay-Z as an artist, he associates himself with this other element. But it's also important that it's in like this city. It's in this huge, culturally, historically important city. It's in this culturally important collection. I would suggest to you that any artwork that you look at is operating with that kind of subjective association. So even the way that, say, Warhol adapts what he knew, because he studied graphic design, he studied commercial design well before he was, being an artist, being a painter. And then he uses that type of structure and pulls Marilyn Monroe into it. Then what comes out of it is a differently crafted association. So something that's a pretty fast read, if you pause for a minute and you go into the associations, you could start to pull something out of it. Similarly, when I put my work up, and you see those T's, and then you see, a little flyer for Ferdinand Hodler down here, or you see these geometric solids, or you see this book, or you see that wine. And now I'm not Jay-Z, and I'm not in the Met. But I am crafting subjective associations, and I'm bringing disparate elements together. And I'm building it with attention, not to make an intellectual argument, but to make an emotional argument, to make an emotional statement in the world about value, about meaning, about importance, about what I've experienced, what I've seen. None of you know, but I know that when I first was in undergrad and I was doing the Albers color theory mixing, this was the cup that I used to mix my paints in. So it's this object that has been with me for so many years. You might say, well, okay, there's biography. Does biography matter? Yes, because we're human beings. Some people say biography shouldn't matter, it's only what is obvious in the work. But I would say that you don't put anything into the work unless it is subjectively, sentimentally obvious to you. And there may be senses in which you don't even know that it's obvious to you, but you do it anyway. I think that just like we all have our own handwriting, we all have our own sense of scale, none of us can get away from those things that motivate us. So we can pretend that we're cold and that we have an analytical eye, but I would challenge anybody, if you really value that object, if you really value that painting, if you really value that music, if you really value that performance, if you really value that writing, there must be something in there that is not explainable in that intellectual pursuit. There's something beyond that you're going for. This is from early in our engagement in Afghanistan. These are the Bamiyan Buddhas that were blown up by the Taliban in 2001. So for 1,000 years, people came to the Buddhas, and the Buddhas were a site of engagement for a culture. And then another culture comes in and says, I don't want that site of engagement. And they take it down. We have to decide whether or not we agree with the fact that there's been a loss. I would say that it is not so much our intellectual assent or our technical understanding that lets us know that there's been a loss here. I think it's our subjective awareness of attention and our belief in how other people are able to move in the world and have an existence in the world that is valuable that tells us that there's something wrong with someone coming in and blowing this up. Let's bring it to the community. Let's bring it back down to the community for a second. This is a power figure, informally a nail figure. This is also incidentally from the Met, the collection of the Met. This is a Nkisi Nkondi. This would be in Zaire and Angola. These power figures used to be all over Africa. And now they reside primarily in institutions. In one sense, that's really wonderful that we preserve them. In another sense, it's an indicator of how colonial attitudes have really transpired to create a situation where these communities can't engage with their faith structures the way that they used to. But this is not just an object that is meant to be religious or meant to be votive, although it is. It's also meant to be a history of the community. So every single nail and every single medicine packet and every single piece of fabric that has been, and every bead that has been placed into this object is an indicator of the cultural memory of that community. So when a person comes up and they move along the figure and they nail in a nail, which is almost like a prayer, saying, it has been a hard year. I am indicating that it has been a hard year by nailing this nail in. And as they move over that figure, they touch the nail that their grandfather put in, or they touch the medicine packet that their mother put in when they were being born. And there's this crafting of a subjective association across time in the object. The power of the object is because human beings engaged with it. So to me, it's actually very, very, in some sense, I'm devastated to see them in an institution. Because they're meant to be in the middle of the town. They're meant to be where the people can come and touch them and be with them and mark history. They can walk up and say, this is what happened to my uncle. This was a beautiful thing that happened in our community. This is when we got sick. This is when our leader was born. It's a whole range of information that can be brought up through that object. You can't tell me that that's not sentimental. But that doesn't make it any less true, and it doesn't make it any less real or impactful. In fact, I think it makes it more impactful. It focuses our attention. Through the intention of individual people, we sense the attention of the community. I think that happens with artworks too. Now, it can be positive or negative. There's obviously a difference when Picasso appropriates a cultural mode in order to make an image. So he's working, this is sort of a synthetic cubism period, and he's appropriating these masks. I would say that there is, these mask-like forms. I would say that there is a drastically different ethic and attitude between something like this and something like this. It seems to me that Picasso is attempting to craft, he's using what all artists do. He's taking two things, disparate elements, and he's associating them. But I would say that maybe he's not being as thoughtful as he could have been. What does it mean to put a sacred mask on prostitutes? What does he know about the African culture that he's appropriated? Right? Think about that. So even in a work that I think is problematic, because I'm accepting the fact that it's a subjective engagement, I can learn something, I can have an experience with it, I can understand something through that. A lot of people misunderstood this back in the 90s. This is Chris O'Feely's Virgin Mary. And they didn't know that in the cultural traditions that he is using, the elephant dung, you can see down here, is actually an honorific, right? It's a indicator of value. So in the West, in Peoria, the elephant dung might be considered a negative thing. Why would you put that on the Virgin Mary? But in the cultural structures that he's pulling from, he's saying, no, this is an honor. This is a way for me to show honor. Very interesting. And then, of course, the fact of the matter is, there's a lot of sort of semi-pornographic images up there people also had a question about, concern about. The mouth seems to be somewhat depictive of genitals. And yet, when you look at any image of Mary throughout church history, throughout the history of the Renaissance in the West. You will see her inside a mandorla, inside a vesicapeses, inside the threshold between the divine and the mundane. I don't know if you can get any more powerful than that kind of association. So if you look up what vesicapeses means and you look up what the mandorla means, it's actually very similar to what Ophelia is talking about here. Subjective engagement. Do I allow myself to dominate the work, or do I submit to it? Do I try to understand and submit to the subjective structure that the artist is providing to me? Another one that people got upset about back in the 90s was Andre Serrano's Piss Christ. And again, so easy to misread it unless you're paying attention. So easy to misread it unless you know something about the theology that he's talking about. He's actually referencing this idea of the hypostatic union where Christ, who's divine, comes into the mundane and is literally covered technically with like the vile, detritus of humanity in a way. And it means even more, and it's more personal, because this is Serrano's urine. So he's saying that I needed this intervention. He's saying that I needed, personally, this is my urine, this is my filth that Christ is coming into. So it's not a lowering of Christ, it's a raising of himself in that redemptive act. The hypostatic union. I think it's very easy to see objects and see paintings and see situations as absolutely negative or absolutely positive, when the reality is that the subjectivity of it is so much more at odds and at question and up in the air than that. So Rene Cox's Last Supper, again, people get worried about these things. But it's so interesting, and don't worry, I'll bring this back around. It's so interesting that people get very concerned about stuff like this or that or this. When a lot of people wear crosses, what is a cross? It's a torture device, right? The Romans used crosses as a torture device all over Europe, all over the Middle East. Killed thousands of people this way. So isn't it really unique and very interesting that, like, your conservative, very, very religious grandma wears a cross that's actually a torture device that was used for ethnic and racial and religious, like, devastation of entire areas of Europe and Central Asia for hundreds and hundreds of years. And they wear it around their neck. Now think about that. How did that happen? How did it happen? How did it go from this to this? It did it because associations, crafted associations, subjective associations, attention, and intentionality conspired to do something the intellect would never do. This is the problem that I have with people who are, very, very concerned about appearing to be like they know it all, or they have it all down, or my work actually equals this. If you are doing equations, if your work is equations, I don't think you're a mathematician. If you're an artist in any of the disciplines, that kind of hard, weird, difficult, messy, associative context should be a part of what's going on, I think. So when I do an artwork like this, I'm very concerned with it meaning something to me, but I'm also concerned with it building points of access for other people. Now, in some sense, probably 90% of the time people don't get 90% of the work. No matter what it is, right? No matter whose work it is. You guys are all the expert on your own work. And I may, over time, become an expert in visual dynamics and understand composition, and understand history, and understand philosophy, and I may be able to get some of it. And I've put indicators in this painting about all those things. But ultimately, it's an artifact of me thinking about being in the world. So if I were to give you what I would consider to be kind of a definition of what art is, and how it dovetails with that association and subjectivity and sentimentality. I would say that art is a class of human work that translates experiences of being in powerful, evocative, strange ways that hopefully resonates with other people because they've had similar experiences, or because they can see the association to an experience that they've had. And that when you engage with that work, you are stimulated in your awareness of being. One of my favorite things to read with grad students is Gaston Bachelard, and his two fantastic books that really talk about these ideas. And one of the things he talks about in The Poetics of Reverie is the idea of astonishment of being. And that one of the things that's really amazing about children is that they're always constantly astonished. They see something and they're astonished. And as you get older, it's very, very hard to maintain astonishment. And I think that the message that Bachelard tells us is that when we can become aware, we can be astonished. In some sense, I've never seen those teeth the way I saw them after I painted it. In painting it, they become new to me, right? In paying attention to something, it becomes new to me. That's the sentimentality. That's the associative context. So when I go up to a painting, and I encourage you to go see the show that I curated here. When you go up to the painting and you look at it and it's so banal and you're like, why is it like that? I would hope that you would say, someone paid attention. Their attention must be connected to some intentionality that they have. They must have given me some kind of, albeit subjective, point of access to that work. They must have, because they made it. How does that make us sentimental? Well, I think I've sort of proved it to some degree. People can question on it, though. You can push back. I think as cold as we might believe our judgments to be, our experiences and our emotions are still realities. I think that that's one of the biggest things that I try to bring to my students. That's one of the biggest things I try to bring to my kids. One of my daughters is adopted. We're thinking about adopting again soon. You have to grasp their felt reality. They have not had the same experiences you've had. When I come up to my students, I want them to know that they have had a different experience from me, but it's just as valid as mine. And I think that when I go into the art space, whether it's a gallery, whether it's a studio, I want to be open to embracing the subjectivity of my own understanding, of my own sense of what's happening in that work. So just like changing a torture device into the symbol of redemption, or transforming a nail into a metaphor for communal experience, like on the power figure, or just like Natalie having this experience when she was young with her dad going down to the stream and picking up a rock, and that informs how she makes sculpture 25 years later, right? I think that is where the sentimental comes in. It's an artifact of human engagement. When I make a work, it's an artifact of human engagement. It can be transformative if we want it to be. I'll take questions if people want. I love questions. If you guys want to do questions, I'll do questions. Yeah.
How do you think about sentimentality and these kind of things? I mean, in this, the subjective associations that supposedly are in most of this, when it comes to abstract expressionism, something that is where our work is based on maybe a natural process that there may not actually be. Maybe, I don't know, I guess.
Well, I think that one of the things that is really important to remember is that over time, attitudes change. I mean, I know that I've had plenty of students who they want to do the big abstract expressionist mark, but they're not living in 1946. And they haven't seen the things that de Kooning saw. You know what I mean? And so in some sense, is it possible to make good abstract work? Absolutely. It is. It is possible. But what I would say is that the associations change with the times. you know, and you could say that in almost any field. I think that we go through ebbs and flows where there's more power to a certain type of form and maybe less power to a certain type of form based on the context that surrounds it. But that doesn't mean a person can't do it. Now, I will say that it's important to be thoughtful and edit yourself to some degree. I mean, I had students that will come up and they make this abstract painting and they're like, this means the inner turmoil of my blah, 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 blah. And I don't see that in the work, right?
Sure.
But then again, I may do something that's super technical and has all these lines of history and philosophy and nobody gets it either. So, in some sense, I want to let them do that. I want them to have that outlet if they want it. But I also want them to realize that they need to build up that ability to build a point of access for somebody else. So I think it's important, and I think that there are actually some amazing painters who do it. Like somebody like Amy Silman is able to invigorate abstract mark making, the abstract expressionist hand, while at the same time pulling in a kind of a playful logic that when you look at it, you totally see the pedamente of how she's building and how it's coming and going, and that it's not just toward one end, but has multiple avenues of approach. And I think that there are plenty of artists that know how to do that. There are plenty of forms that seem totally abstract, like the work of Martin Puryear or something like that. It may appear totally abstract, and yet it actually is very much contained within a specific logic. He knows. Right. So, does that answer it to some degree?
Yeah. And that's the reason I thought it was interesting because, you think about, of course, Pollock and, him being in touch with nature and trying to be nature,
mm-hmm.
and really doing some serious self-investigation while creating these large things. Mm-hmm. I thought it was great.
Yeah, and in some sense, you could call BS on it too.
Well, sure.
You could say, okay, dude, you just want to play. You just want to play with, let's not get too highfalutin, But I think that there's a place for that, though. I think that there's a place for, the enfant terrible, the crazy artist who is really just trying to make an expression and not trying to evaluate it. And then there are the ones, like Julian Schnabel, and they get old and fat, and they just are not really doing anything anymore. They maybe in the 80s they were doing something when they were 28, but now that they have too much money. So in some sense, maybe that, yeah. It's a danger, particularly in an academic setting, where you want to give people freedom, but you don't want to get just a bunch of BS. So I want people to kind of evaluate what I mean and what they think I mean when I say something like sentimentality. Because I think that so often in the art world we kind of say, no, it can't be sentimental. I'm like, what are you talking about? Everything you're doing is sentimental. So much of what happens is sentimental.
I think that one of the people have a hard time with the word with emotions when it comes to looking at art. So they may graft sentimentality with emotions, and they're completely connected, but they're different.
Right.
Like you said earlier, emotions are the feeling, and then we're talking about something else.
Yeah. And it's also something too where most of the younger people in the room don't know, but there was a pretty dramatic shift in the 60s, 70s, and 80s in terms of art theory, where we started to be bringing in semiotics and philosophy coming out of literature that transformed the way that we talked about art. So then you have that on one end, and then you have the sciences on the other end, and the academy putting pressure. And then suddenly, none of those great New York abstract expressionists could make that work in the institution today. Almost, people would just be like, really? So that's one of the reasons why I love to look back at Diebenkorn, because there's no evaluation at all. It's just, I'm going to make this, and I'm not going to try to justify it. And I actually appreciate that as an exploration form, as an exploration of the logic. Because ultimately, whether it's material, like I was talking about Ian and his palpable, muddy things, or me with visual dynamics in terms of representation, those things are going to have their own logic. That's different from anything I could say about them.
It's really funny too. You see Serrano's Piss Christ, and then you see these things that might be blasphemy to religious organizations. but, or sort of idea of religion or whatever. But seeing Jay-Z and Beyonce trying to equate themselves with the Mona Lisa is like, you know, like drives me insane because, and they're out, and of course the appropriation is part of the whole thing,
But and also the history of that just goes back on. If you look at any Christian church from the Middle Ages in Wales, Scotland, or England, you are going to find a Sheila and the Gig figure. Does anybody know what a Sheila and the Gig is? A Sheila and the Gig is a sculptural figure of a woman holding open her vulva. And they're all over these churches. Why? Because the people who were going to the church were pagan. And the church was trying to bring these people in. So by having this amazing Sheila and the Gig, they were actually building an association between the pagan earth religions and Mary. They were building those associations. You can go into almost any of those older churches, you're going to find Sheila and the Gigs there. So I think that those associations happen all over the place. And there are actually amazing images of it, where like the woman is showing her stuff and it's killing the demons and stuff. It's like a positive thing. It's like totally about empowerment. It's not like witches and stuff. It's like, this is the Earth's force power. Boom, and it's blowing away the demons.
Do you really think that Jay-Z is that
intelligent?
Well, see, I don't want this to sound like I discredit hip-hop, pop culture, or him even, but do you think he's thinking about these things as cogently as you are?
I think that, particularly with Magna Carta, like reality.
Yeah.
And you have to realize too, is that, like, I mean, this guy has been multi-millionaire for 20 years. He's a different person than he was when he started out.
Yeah.
And so his approach and the access that he has, if we all had access to the things that he has access to now, we would be sophisticated in a different way too. Now, it's not necessarily good or bad, right? I would say that it makes sense that he would think. Now you could really go the other way. You could say, why do you, as an empowered black man, feel like you have to associate with this historically white structure, power structure? That could be a question you could ask him. I think that he would have an answer.
Well, but you see too in pop culture, especially with people like Jaden Smith and even Miley Cyrus and Justin Bieber, people who maybe have had access that people their age normally wouldn't have access, attempting to associate themselves with these kind of large figures and failing at it because they haven't, because I think that maybe we as a culture might view their history as something that they haven't had that opportunity to create sentimentality.
But even in those, I mean, if you think about the ways in which white artists for the last 60, 70 years have tried to appropriate black music.
Oh, sure.
I mean,
Sure.
It goes both ways. I would say that to me it feels like Jay-Z is trying to do that. He's aware of what he's doing. I think it's. But the fact of the matter is that you can question it too. You know, it's not like just because he did it, it works. You know, right. I think it's good to question it.
I have one question about your work specifically.
Yeah.
I don't think you and I have ever talked about this. We've looked at this image quite a bit. Can you talk about why your work appears on the round form, tondo, right? That's what it's called.
Yeah, let me put it back up.
And the hexagonal, or sorry.
Well, it's started to change. For a long time, I painted on squares and rectangles. And then there was a point at which, about almost 10 years ago, it was a little bit after I came to Mizzou, where I really felt like I was solving the composition in the exact same way. Like, I come out of a direct painting tradition, so from Edwin Dickinson to Fairfield Porter, you know, that kind of range. But I was also super influenced by people like Elmer Bischoff and David Park and Richard Evencorn. And so the compositional logic that I was using in the rectilinear form just became this thing that I was just doing it in the same way. And I wanted to find a way to break it off and do it a different way. I also felt that I wanted to make representational images that were not windows and doors. I view this as an asymmetrical mandala. This is an asymmetrical mandala form. It is not meant to be necessarily depictive in the sense of being like a window. So all of my Tondo work is meant to act, and it does. When you look at the history of mandalas, you look at the history of Tondos, you look at how they've been used throughout time, it's always a completely different type of transmundane space. And I would suggest that if, I have a whole long lecture, which I will not do, because it would be like 3 more hours, but where I basically contrast the Eastern mandala form with the Western mandala form. Everything from like the Vescapesses and the Mandorla that I mentioned with Mary to halos, those things all go back to the mandala. And that point of concentration where you quiet your mind. It's the same principle. So I just wanted to try to, the fact of the matter is though is that now I'm breaking back out. I don't know why. I'm starting to do more square and rectilinear images again after 8 or 9 years. So, but I still, I find that it gives me a really beautiful, different kind of compositional logic. That's why.
You said a poster that's up for your child. That work is so very different than this.
That one is built from, I started out, the one that's on the card, or the one that's on the flyer, is actually much larger than this one. This one is actually 2 feet in diameter, and that one that's on the card, or on the flyer, is 4 feet in diameter. And I build my own polyhedra, so I had built a bunch of dodecahedrons, 12-sided, regular solid. And then I started to paint them from observation on the surface. And then as I went in that painting, I started to use the angles to build off. So it moves from being a representational space to a completely sort of design space. And the idea was that there's a play between what reads as a spatial illusion and what reads as a completely flat kind of structure or a superstructure. I would actually say that the work that I do that is abstract and the work that I do that's representational are almost exactly the same. I have another talk about that too. But the way in which what I might call, I'm going to borrow it from physics, but like angular momentum, like how your eye will travel and move. I'm designing this one to do that in the same way that I do with the abstract ones. It's about what I borrow from Diebenkorn and Ferdinand Hodler is this idea of lines of force and lines of energy that push the eye, and that's so it's basic 2D design, but that's informing this and it's informing the other. Did I talk you guys to death?
That was great, Matt. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming.